Dufu, Night in the Pavilion. At the end of the year, yin and yang make the days shorter. At the end of the earth, frost and snow brighten cold nights. Drums and trumpets, sad and loud, wake me at dawn. The river of stars still shining above the three gorges. In the countryside, 1,000 families weep at word of war. Everywhere, fishermen and woodcutters sing Tartar songs. Chu Giliang and Gong Sung Shu both ended up dead in yellow earth. My days ran out here alone with no word from home. So, we continue with Du Fu's heptasyllabic regulated poems. Just as the previous poem was about spending the night at the general's headquarters, this poem is also about spending the night awake in some other place. So let's create some background, let's give some background for this poem. Now, this poem was written 2 years later than the previous one, in 766. What has happened since then? Well, Du Fu's patron, Jian Wu, had died, and after his death, some rebellions and mutinies had taken place in the territory of Shu, meaning that it was no longer a safe a haven, a safer refuge, as it had been during the previous years for Du Fu and his family. We also remember that in previous poems, Du Fu had stated his desire, now that an apparent peace had come upon the realm, and now that the heartland, the area of Luoyang and of the Yellow River Valley, had been recovered by the imperial forces, to go back home, to go back to Luoyang. And his intention was to take a rather circuitous route, basically going from Shu to the upper reaches of the Jiangzi River, and then going down the Jiangzi River until its middle course, and then going up through the land until reaching Luoyang. So it was a pretty long distance he was planning to travel, and not in the best of health at this time. I think he was half blind, half deaf, and suffering from other ailments due to old age. In fact, he started on this return home, but he never reached Luoyang. He died a few years later while still going down the Yangtze River. So, at the time of writing this poem, we say it's 766, he had reached the area of Guizhou, the city of Guizhou, also known as Baidicheng. So, this is an area just on the outskirts of the province of Shu, and just in the area where it meets the Jiangzi River, at the beginning of the three gorges. So, in this area, there are three big gorges that made navigation difficult downstream. They're also monumental landmarks and very beautiful sites. After passing them, the progression on boat down the Yangtze would have been more stable. So here in Guizhou, we know that Du Fu stopped for a couple of years until 768 before moving on. Now, one of Jiang Wu's friends or subordinates was serving in this region, so he gave a certain degree of protection to Du Fu while he was here, and he gave him some sinecure or position as secretary or something. And he was hosted in what was called the West House, which is translated here as Pavillion. So here we have Du Fu in this pavilion, in this city, running away from the minor chaos in Shu, inside the major chaos of the aftermath of the Anlushan rebellion, wishing to go home at the end of the year, which is the most melancholy time in traditional Chinese poetry, and hoping to return home and expressing his loneliness, his sadness, at typical thoughts such as the passage of time and the death of great figures. So, themes of this poem, very similar to the ones we mentioned in the previous poem. There is this general wakefulness at night tone, which, is really part of a subgenre of Chinese poetry, where the poet cannot sleep because of things that worry him and that keep him away. Those things are generally absence from a beloved one, but, they sometimes acquire political overtones. There's a seasonal element, it's the end of the year. Winter is not commonly a protagonist of many Chinese poems. It's not the elegant season, it's just a dark, and cold and negative season. In traditional China, for example, executions only took place if they could be postponed in winter. So it was the season of death. And although it has its beauties, as the poem here reflects. So seasonal element, there's a landscapey element, not major but minor, in describing the sites around Guizhou and referencing also the historical background surrounding this area through those two legendary figures that appear in line 7. But of course, the general tone and the general idea is, lamenting different events, basically national and personal damage, and in this case, his lack of ability to return home, and the country still being in chaos. So, and this is the Du Fu trademark in his poems, although others, of course, did it as well. This mixture of this juxtaposition of private grief and national grief at one and the same time. So as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. At the end of the year, yin and yang make the days shorter. At the end of the earth, frost and snow brighten cold nights. So as usual, the first couplet locates us temporarily and spatially. It gives us a more specific location than perhaps the title would. So we're at declining moments, and we're at far away areas. We are at the end of the year, so winter, the winter months. And at the end of the year in the Chinese calendar was, the 10th, 11th, and 12th months, which were winter. Spring, the first month of the new year began with spring. So we're at the end of the year, and we're at the end of the earth, so in a very marginal, peripheral area of the Tang Empire, very far away from the Yellow River and from the capitals. This area of Guizhou was only partially Sinicized at this time. Still, a big part of its population was mostly non-Chinese, like native tribes and aboriginals, and it started, in fact, to become more colonized by Chinese people in the aftermath of the Alishan Rebellion, and it would later continue to prosper. But, at this time, it was still a place of relative exile and, not near anywhere relevant, and, So, at this place, it's winter. It's a cold winter night. Yin Yang make the day shorter. Chinese believed in the 5 elements in the yin yang. So they believe that there was this yearly cycle of rising yin, then yin matching yang, then rising yang, and all over again. Winter is the season of maximum yin. Yin is the basic force for femininity, for coldness, for flexibility and adaptation. So winter is the time of water. Winter is the time of maximum yin. And it's also when the days are short and the nights are long. And, of course, in this cold night in winter in this area, there's frost and snow, and their white, shiny lustre seems to illuminate the darkness of the night. So it's quite a pretty wintry image. But again, I would say it's pretty, especially for us, Western readers, perhaps. For the Chinese, it would probably include more ominous overtones beyond the beauty of frost and snow. Second couplet. Drums and trumpets, sad and loud, wake me at dawn. The river of stars still shining above the 3 gorges. So the first poem, as we said, located the chronotope. The first couplet established the chronotope. We are in the margins of the world in some western region, which is not too specified, and it's in winter. The second couplet extends this, it gives us a little bit more detail. It gives us what time of night or morning is the poem talking about and is composing this poem in. And it also gives us a more specific geographical location. So drums and trumpets, this is a military area at a time of relatively military upheaval. And among the watches that the military soldiers kept, one of the things they did was announce nighttime and announce morning with the beating of drums and the playing of trumpets. So drums and trumpets sound. Their sounds are sad. Du Fu wakes up. In the original poem, the fifth hour is mentioned, which would have been the equivalent to dawn. But the nights are so long now in winter that it's, the sun isn't out. It's still pretty dark outside, and this is seen by the fact that the River of Stars, which is the Chinese poetic name for the Milky Way, is still shining clearly above the three gorges. Now, these three gorges locate us they bring us closer to the place where Du Fu is. So it's morning. He's woken up by the sad military music that reminds him that the country is still at war and in relative chaos. He looks out. There's no sun to be seen. It's still all darkness, with only the shining path of the Milky Way and creating some light, illuminating above the three gorges. Now, this couplet was much liked by later poems. In fact, I think Sushi, the greatest poem of the Song dynasty, and arguably the second or third greatest Chinese poet of all time, so immediately after Du Fu and Li Bai, he considered it the best couplet in the classical Chinese poetry. So, quite a thing, and quite a compliment. Next couplet. The third couplet, again, we've seen this in many poems. There is a zoom out here from a starting point that is very generic. The next couplet is a bit more specific. And the third couplet moves us from description of the landscape or the environment, which is typically done in the first two couplets, towards the feelings of the poetic persona and his biographical experiences and troubles. So this is very typical in a Chinese lushi. Like the first half, the first two couplets set the background, but also, they give landscapey descriptions of nature, whereas the last two couplets, focus on the feelings of the poetic persona, and perhaps on or also some background, but biographical, historical background, as opposed to nature, landscape background. So the third couplet brings us some information about the chaotic state of the country, the endless, in the countryside, 1,000 families weep at word of war. Everywhere, fishermen and woodcutters sing Tartar songs. So the situation is in much upheaval. War is looming. People have panic. The common people are in a state of panic or terror, hoping not to hear news of war reaching their locations and devastating their means of living. Du Fu is part of those thousands of people, of those 1,000 families who is weeping at the very word war and at its reality coming to their neighborhood. One interesting thing, the second line is a bit ambiguous. It says that the common people are singing Tartar songs. I imagine this can be interpreted in two ways. Either it's a reference to the fact that this area of Guizhou was still only partially Sinicized, which means, the inner barbarians, the tribes that were subdued by Chinese might, were still the majority in this area, so you could hear their songs there. It might be a reference to foreign invaders, to the danger and the presence of invading troops, the Tartars from the north, northwest, that might be roaming this area. And so that's why their songs are heard. But it's an ominous, it's not a pretty image. It's meant to be ominous and dark, like the whole tone of this poem is. Finally, the last couplet includes a historical reference, which is also a geographical reference here, because it's about two people who were relatively important here in this area of Guizhou, in which Du Fu is staying. And it also concludes with the feelings directly stated of the poem. I'm far from home, I receive no news, I am sad. Zhuge Liang and Gong Sung Shu both ended up dead in yellow earth. My days ran out here, alone, with no word from home. So, although partly Sinicized, this area of Guizhou had already been part of the Chinese Empire since at least the Han Dynasty. And during the time of the end of the Han Dynasty, the time of the Three Kingdoms, of which we've talked a lot, this was one of the areas in which the troops of the kingdom of Shu fought out against the other kingdoms of Wei and Wu during the Three Kingdoms period. Zhuge Liang, you remember, we've talked a lot about him, and we will talk more about him in the next poems. Zhuge Liang was a famous general and hero who became deified as the god of war after he died. He was the main chancellor and minister of Liu Bei, the founder of Shu Han, and he was responsible for the survival and even the expansion of this, the weakest of the three kingdoms, but in theory the most legitimate, as its ruler was a descendant. The ruler was an offshoot of the Han imperial line. So Zhuge Liang is connected with this area, especially because he lived here for a time and he had some battles here. And I think there was a temple to him here, because I think his emperor Liu Bei died in the area relatively close to Guizhou in one of the battles in which he was trying to expand his kingdom. So Zhuge Liang, the great hero of this area, or that roamed this area, is dead. Gong Sung Shu is also dead. In fact, in the original poem, their names are not mentioned. Nicknames are used for both Zhuge Liang and Gong Sung Shu. I don't remember them because I don't have here a literal translation, but something like rising, crouching dragon and something horse or something like that. Riding horse, something like that. Gong Sung Shu, another important area here. He was the founder of the city of Guizhou, or at least a nearby city called Baidicheng, the White Empress city. Zhuge Liang is a figure from the late Eastern Han, early Three Kingdoms. Gong Sung Shu is an earlier figure at the beginning of the Eastern Han dynasty, in the chaos after the murder of Wang Mang and the fight for dynastic succession. This Gong Sung Shu proclaimed himself king of Shu and managed to rule the area for about a decade. And so he was a relatively important person in this area, and especially associated with this city. So both these great figures from the past, from the Han dynasty, from the Eastern Han, Zhuge Liang, Gong Sung Shu, they're gone, they're dead. And, this association of them with this area automatically connects also with an association with death, which is what Du Fu talks about in the last line. My days ran out here, alone, with no word from home. So Du Fu gets no surcease from sorrow. He's spending his time here in Guizhou. He is not happy. He wants to move on. He feels he might end up living and dying here. And he's getting no words from his home, Luojiang, which is the place where he wants to go back to. So quite a nice poem, quite sad and quite melancholy. But then again, that's very common for Du Fu's last poems, if not for all Chinese poetry in general.